Australia was colonised by the British in 1788. Today, that moment is often framed as a violent invasion, an act of theft, or even genocide. But is that what really happened? In this video, we're going to take a look at the colonisation of Australia through historical facts and legal context, not modern ideological filters. Because when you strip away the revisionism, the reality is clear. The colonisation of Australia was completely justified. A quick disclaimer before we start that this is an educational video based on the documented facts of the time and is not based on anyone at Australian Guard's particular political opinion or views in any way. If you want to support us so we can continue to make content like this, check out and buy our new merch line or consider becoming a YouTube channel member or Patreon. Link in the description below. Let's begin with the legal basis for colonisation. The international law of Terra Nullius, which is Latin for land belonging to no one. Under 18th century international law, if a land was not settled in a recognizable way with farming, permanent housing, or a central government, which the Aboriginal people had none of, then it was legally unclaimed land and could legally be claimed by another nation. This wasn't unique to Australia either. It was the same standard used by France, Spain, Portugal, and others across the globe. When Captain Arthur Phillip arrived in 1788, Aboriginal people were not farming the land, did not live in permanent settlements, and had no centralized government. So under the law of nations, the international law of the time, the British Crown's declaration of sovereignty was completely legal. In fact, this legal claim of the land in Australia stood for over 200 years until just recently it was overturned in 1992 by the High Court in the Mabo case. A decision based on modern principles, not the historical legal standards which Terra Nullius stood under from the 1400s all the way until 1975. It's also important to understand how British sovereignty was claimed. Unlike in New Zealand, where a treaty was signed, or North America, where violent conquests happened, apparently, in Australia, no war of invasion took place in 1788. It is historically documented that the British arrived without firing a shot, unlike the very recent propaganda narrative. Then they established a colony and followed peaceful administrative processes. The Brits didn't see the Aboriginal population as a sovereign nation, as there was no centralized tribal leadership, no capital city, no border army, just hundreds of small tribes very spread out, often hostile to one another. Because of this and their orders from King George III, which we'll get to later, the Brits had no motive or intention to go to war for the land. So sovereignty wasn't taken by force. It was a declared occupation, which again was standard legal process under international law. The first governor of the British settlers, Arthur Phillip, was given strict instructions by King George III to treat Aboriginal people with respect, and he followed these orders. Phillip's direct orders from King George were to, quote, live in amity and kindness with them, end quote. And historically, he did. Even when a little bit into the settling, some Aboriginal tribes threw spears at his men. Phillip refused to retaliate and even warned his men that punishments would be had for killing Aboriginal people or committing crimes against them. Reminder, this is documented history. He repeatedly invited local leaders to dine with him, offered them gifts, and even tried to open the lines of communication. The first acts of violence wasn't from the British, as some people seem to think these days. It was from the local Aboriginals, attacking the newly settled people, the same way that they would attack each other's Aboriginal tribes. Phillip was even speared in the shoulder in 1970, but he refused to seek revenge or retaliate. This was not a conquest. It was a governor under strict Christian and legal instructions trying to build peaceful relations. Some people today speak as if the British arrived in a peaceful, harmonious Aboriginal nation. That is pure myth. Early journals, including those of Watkin Tenk and later anthropological studies, make it clear. Aboriginal society was deeply violent. Unaliving of infants was common in tribes. Ritual revenge killings, including spearing and mutilation, were a form of justice. Cannibalism was documented, not myth, but fact. Rape and pedophilia was also common in tribes, and arranged marriages between grown men in their 40s to 60s with very young girls aged between 6 and 10 was recorded. Now, all those things I described is documented history, so clearly this unfortunately wasn't some peaceful paradise. It was a tribal land governed by violence, fear, and by their primitive cultural spiritualism, as many early settlers and Christian missionaries documented with sadness and horror. The British did not destroy some utopia. They brought law, order, and Christian moral structure to a society that had no unified peace to begin with. Colonization wasn't just a British/Australian thing. In the 18th century, every major power, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, was expanding into the New World, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Britain was one of many doing what was seen as legal and normal. Back then, there were no United Nations, no Geneva Convention, no human rights doctrine. Nations expanded to gain land, trade, and security. That's how global politics worked. To act as if Australia's colonization was uniquely evil is historically false. And let's be real, if Britain hadn't colonized Australia, someone else would have. By the early 1800s, both China and Japan were expanding regional power, and neither of those empires, especially Japan, had any hesitation about brutal conquest. Their systems weren't based on Christian mercy, but on imperial dominance and racial supremacy. Once again, this is documented history, and you just have to look at what happened with Japan and what they did in Korea and China, in the early 20th century. Millions killed, cultures erased, languages banned. If the Chinese or Japanese had reached Australia in force before the British did, do you really think that the Aboriginal people would still exist today? It's unlikely. It was precisely because Britain brought law, structure, and Christian values that the Aboriginal people survived at all. In just over 100 years, colonization turned Australia from scattered tribal groups that hadn't invented the wheel into a unified modern nation. Let's be clear, that development didn't happen by accident. The British built cities with clean water and sanitation, roads, ports and railways, hospitals and schools, a system of democracy and civil administration, a free press and economic opportunity. The country went from a Stone Age culture to one of the most prosperous and stable nations on Earth, thanks to the foundations led by and made by the British settlers. That is not, quote, oppression. That's nation and society building. And we can't forget the spiritual and religious dimension either. Unlike many empires that came only for gold or slaves, the British, especially in Australia, were driven by Christian principles. Christian missionaries set up schools and churches. Governors were expected to uphold Christian morality, which, pretty much all of them did. Reformers in Britain like William Wilberforce pushed for better treatment of Aboriginal people and the end of slavery. Even Governor Phillip himself was a devout Christian who believed in peace, respect, and civilizing through moral leadership, which he showed. And as late as the 20th century, prime ministers spoke proudly of these Christian foundations, and for good reason. In 1901, at the Federation of Australia, Australia's population was over 96% Christians, and that number remained extremely high all the way until the late 60s, when foreign peoples and powers gained control after World War II. But this high percentage of Christians was a major contributing factor to why Australia had one of the lowest crime rates, sexual assault rates, rape and murder rates in the entire world, which now is completely different and the rates are a lot higher. In 1942, Prime Minister John Curtin said Australia was, quote, a land of peaceful settlement founded on Christian ideals and for the rule of law, end quote. And for all Australian history, that was the accepted truth. Only in the last 40 years has this narrative been changed and rewritten, and not by historians. So let's review the facts. The land was claimed legally under international law. There was no war of conquest in 1788, not even a bullet fired. The British arrived peacefully and tried to coexist. Aboriginal society was already violent, divided, and extremely underdeveloped. Colonization brought law, order, prosperity, and Christian morality. And until very recently, Australians openly acknowledged this as our foundation and have been proud of it. Colonization, newsflash, wasn't a crime. It was a civilizational shift, one that brought light, order, and truth to a land that had never known them on a national scale. And we Australians shouldn't have to apologize for that. We should actually be thankful. Like and share this video to help more Aussies and the world understand our history. Check out our merch and consider becoming a YouTube channel member or Patreon, links in the description below. And check out the video on screen now. God bless Australia and Christ is King.